Welcome to day 27, Tuesday, 21st of April. Not long to go now. We might get back to some semblance of normal, whatever that might be. But a little bit more on tubes and a bit of vinyl and some nostalgia and old magazines and stuff today. So stand by, it's going to be a beauty. A little more on tubes today. So a question often asked is, well, I can see the light inside my tube, so it must be good. Well, that's not necessarily correct, because the light that you see in the tube, the glowing element, is actually the heater element that is going. That heater has a small voltage on it, usually about 5 volts, as I mentioned before, and that's just to heat up the cathode. That heater circuit, I don't think I've ever seen a heater fail in a tube ever. Where you normally get problems with tubes is you get shorts between the grids and the anode, or the grids and the cathode, and that will give you the tube glowing red and blowing a fuse. Or you may get other problems with tubes, noise or crackling or things like that. But you very rarely see a heater circuit die in a tube amp because of the low voltage and the fact that all they're doing is supplying a small current to heat up that material on the tube and get it to emit electrons. So don't be fooled if your tube is lighting up, it is not necessarily good. What we do is we use a tube tester to test tubes, and I will just move this camera to show you what one of those looks like and how you go about testing a tube. Okay, so here we have my ancient tube tester, and I have put a Gold Lion KT88 into the tester. You set up these knobs and buttons according to the tube. There's a chart on the roll in the middle there that allows you to see which positions to put the various switches into. They're setting the different bias settings and heater settings, the various pin configurations for the different tubes. So you can test all manner of tubes on this. So the idea is that you basically flick these buttons here up to the test line for particular parameters, and you won't test every button for every tube, but in the case of a KT88 you set these buttons as per this, and then you flick this to the test line looking to see if there's any change in the meter or if you get a short on your filament. So we will go through and do 3, 4 and 5, and then we will test to see whether there are any shorts on the filament, and there isn't because our light is not lighting up there. And then we test for the tube, and you can see the meter is reading that tube is good. It should be. I just took it out of the box, it's brand new. Now if you had a faulty tube, of course, normally it would be a cathode short, which would be this filament here that would be glowing when your tube was shorted. There may be other tubes faults as well, but those are the main ones that you'll get. Or when you push that button, this meter will read down in the red, meaning that the tube has not got good material left in it, so it's basically just worn out through those electrons being depleted from the elements in the tube, and therefore it's worn out. So that happens just like tyres wear out on a car, tubes wear out with time. So that's a little bit of a rundown on tube testing. Just a little aside, this particular socket is called an octal base. That's what a lot of power output tubes have. It's octal because there are 8. So there's a keyway here, and then there are, counting around from there, counting either way I guess, you'll count 8 pins. So when we go to plug a tube in, we line up the keyway, which is the rib that's on the centre Bakelite of the tube, We line that up with the keyway and we plug it in. Now, just for the purposes of demonstration, I found a tube which is a faulty tube, and so when we test for our cathode short on switch number 8, we find that it doesn't have any problems with the cathode short, but when we actually test it, we see that the needle is dropping down. It's slowly going up into the good, but actually, no, that tube I wouldn't trust, because when I pushed the button on it before, it went down heavily into the red section, which means it's got something, possibly an intermittent short internally, or there is some other problem with it. But yeah, I wouldn't really trust that as being good. Just to get a little bit of information about B plus voltage, or what is often called bias voltage. So B plus is the high tension, you might call it. HT, it's sometimes marked as on particularly European schematics. And so that's the voltage that's going to the plates. And that's can be anywhere up to 450, 500, 600 volts. So that's why when you set the bias on an amplifier, you bias it for a particular amount of current per tube. In the case of VTL amps that I'm familiar with, it'll be somewhere around 250 to 275 milliamps. If you've got 4 tubes in that amplifier, each drawing 250 milliamps, that is 1 amp all up. So you will normally have a B plus fuse that is 1 amp, so that anything that is drawn, any current that's drawn above the nominal set rate will blow the fuse. In modern amplifiers, which I'll go into a little bit more in a moment, they have circuits that will monitor this automatically, but in the standard old-fashioned amplifier that had a little trim pot for you to adjust, that would be the bias that you are adjusting on the tube. Until you've got some bias on the tube, as we mentioned before, you can't get any operation of the tube because you don't have any electron flow. So I hope that explains that little point about tube amps. Another thing that I've been asked about quite often is, can you put different tubes into an amplifier? Yes, you certainly can. It's called tube rolling. You can go to extremes. PrimaLuna did a demonstration several years ago where they put different output tubes, I mean completely different ones, KT88, KT120, KT90, EL34, into one amplifier. And yes, it ran, which is a great testament to the fact that their automatic biasing can pick up what tube is in there and what its optimum settings should be and adjust for it individually. Very, very clever circuitry to do that. Don't try this in your amplifier at home unless it's a PrimaLuna. So yes, you can tube roll. There are lots of different brands, and look, it's like motorcycle tyre threads or oil threads in car forums. There is just reams of information with everybody having an opinion, some of them actually valid, about tubes. And yes, there will be tubes that people will rave about and they'll say, hey, this tube is so much better sounding. But the fact of the matter is, it might sound better in that one amplifier. Then in a different amplifier, it might sound terrible. So yes, try different tubes by all means. There's lots of different brands and different types of 12AX7s, 12AT7s, AU7s. You name it, there's lots of different tubes. In my experience, you get a bigger difference with the small signal tubes, like the 12AU7s, 12AT7s, 12AX7s, those sort of tubes. You will hear a bigger difference there than you will with power output tubes. The output tubes all have a different character. The EL34 is beautiful in the mid-range, lacks a little bit of punch in the bass, but the KT88 has that punch in the bass, lacks a little bit of that sort of warmth in the mid-range. So yeah, they've all got a different flavour, but you can plug them in, try them out and see what you like best. That's the great thing about tubes. Try doing that with a transistor amp. I'll just change the transistors. Yeah, right. Now a lot of modern amplifiers like the VTLs and the PrimaLunas, they actually put a little computerised circuit into the amplifiers which monitor the bias voltage, and if any tube drags too much current, then rather than the fuse blow, they can intervene with the electronics and shut off the supply to that tube and just bring up an LED that says change this tube. It's made tube amps an awful lot easier to own and much more enjoyable. Just recently I had a tube that decided to go out in my Siegfrieds. It's the first one that I've had that's failed in something like 8 or 9 years. So very, very minimal chances of tubes failing now because of the computer operated systems. They're basically continually monitoring the tube and keeping it at the optimum bias level. And when that tube can no longer be maintained at that level, then the circuit will just say, okay, this tube needs to be replaced, and it'll indicate. And that happened to one of my tubes. In fact, I've just done a test on that tube, and it initially tested as faulty, but then after I pushed the test button again to film the video, it came up and said it was okay, which I know it's not. The amp has said replace this, and I'm picking it's got an intermittent fault in it. But that's the beauties of the modern amplifiers. You don't have the problems that you used to have with not knowing how to test the tube, because the circuitry does that for you. And also the initial turn on current to an amplifier. In the old days when you turned on the amps, you'd see your lights dim down because they got such a solid whack of voltage to those grids, and the high voltage particularly, that with a circuit all cold, you suddenly hit it with high voltage and you're asking for any weak points to be exposed. And that's what used to happen. It was almost always at turn on, you'd get a big flash and an arc and blow a fuse, and then it was, now which tube caused that? And so you'd have to pull all the tubes, put a new fuse in, and go through plugging in one tube at a time until the fuse blew again. Or you'd take all your tubes and put them in a tube tester if you had that luxury, but most people didn't. Those are all things of the past now. With modern tube amps, we just accept that they'll go when you turn them on, and they do, and we get so few problems. Very rare to have a problem with a tube amp now, and if you do, it's just replace a tube. So you have a couple of spares sitting aside and you just pop them in when required. So that's the beauties of modern technology being applied to old circuit designs. I just thought I'd give a little bit of nostalgia. This is an Absolute Sound from September of 1982, and a cool little picture of a baby tube there. And over here, a list of some of the music that was being played back in those days, and I have quite a number of HP's Golden Dozen discs, including the Reiner sound and Scheherazade that's mentioned there, the RCA issue of that. They also mentions Pink Floyd, Dark Side of the Moon and The Wall, and the Sheffield track record, which I'll play one of those tracks at some point. They used to have cute little drawings in these magazines that I used to use quite a bit in my newsletters. There's one of them there of the vinyl balloons, as it were. Another one, the tone arm being carved out of solid. And another, licking the vinyl lollipop. Amplifiers love vinyl. So yeah, some interesting stuff in these older magazines, and I'll share a bit more of that with you in future episodes. Thank you very much for watching my videos. I'd like you to consider subscribing if you'd be so kind, and also please give me a thumbs up if you've liked this video, share it around, and make comments as you feel the need. Thank you very much for watching.